Hello, everybody. I am Ian Williams, the president of the Foreign Press Association, and we convened this session because, well, we'd started before, but it was culminated this week in the sacking of a Washington Post columnist simply for telling the manifest truth. Uh, and previously, columnist from the Washington Post was fired. And we know right across the board there are pressures on journalists to conform with the truth. And we wanted to explore that. One of the other things is, of course, the internal constraints, because the fear of committing thought crime, when all around you are saying that something is so and you know it isn't, how much do you risk a career as a journalist to go out on a limb and tell the truth? So we have Mohamad Bazzi, who was the formerly UN correspondent and then became the Middle East correspondent for New York Newsday, and is now a regular columnist for The Guardian and a professor at NYU Journalism School. So he's intersecting lots of the subjects or areas that we're looking at. Our other panelist, I'm afraid, he was going to a procedure in hospital and we're waiting. He did warn he might be a bit late, but we'll have to carry on without him. That's Chris Gunness. Uh, Chris was formerly a foreign correspondent for the BBC. He left and became very involved in Myanmar because he has Burmese antecedents. And there's a Holocaust going on, which was ignored and brushed under the mat by lots of people. And then famously, he went to work for UNRWA as their spokesman and attracted a lot of contumely for what he said there, which was telling the truth again. And then when he retired from UNRWA and the events in Gaza happened, he stepped up to do commentary in a way that luckily, since he wasn't employed by anyone, they couldn't put pressure on his employers to get rid of him. So it gave him a freedom. It's like me. I'm too veteran to have a career, so I don't worry about my career when I go. I worry about Mohammed, but I've been squeezed out of organizations and papers in the past for thought crime, which is one of the issues we want to go to. Now, Mohammed, you're dealing in your columns with The Guardian with thought crime. You're saying things which many people even though all of us know they're true, are, how should we say, impolitic to say between proprietors and governments and a rather noisy clack of an audience who will disagree. So, I mean, what pressures have you had about your coverage of the Middle East, for example?
Thanks for having me, Ian. I'm right now. I'm in a bit of a position where I have, I have, I have some protection because my primary job is at NYU where I teach in the journalism department. I've been running the Middle East Center, the NYU Center for Middle East Studies for the past 4 years or so, and so I'm lucky in that I have the protection of tenure, at least for now, and it's difficult to remove um, someone from a tenured teaching position for what they write. That's supposed to go to the heart of academic freedom, the concept of academic freedom. Um,
Columbia
and
might, though.
but well, Columbia has some people have been pushed out into early retirement, and yes, no, we've seen with the Trump administration basically holding some of these institutions hostage, holding the funding stream hostage, and board of trustees and administrators at universities. Want to keep the money flowing from the federal government, and they're certainly willing to throw out the noble concept of academic freedom, to throw their faculty under the bus in a lot of ways at those institutions. And we've seen it in other institutions. There have been a few cases of professors with tenure protection who've been pushed out, who've been fired, who've had their tenure removed. It's a process, and they have their tenure removed for what they've written, mostly about Gaza, mostly about Israel's war, Israel's conduct of that war. We now have we're 23 months in. We have many international institutions, including the UN Commission, that weighed in yesterday, just yesterday, on calling it a genocide. And certainly the leading human rights organizations in the world have all called it so. We've had the International Association of Genocide Scholars, if just a few weeks ago, also calling it a genocide. And just putting that aside, uh, just I think anyone following the news and following what's happened in the last 23 months could see a disconnect between what a lot of the legacy media, a lot of the traditional, let's say, what we used to call the mainstream media, what it conveys about Gaza and what social media conveys of what someone trying to find firsthand accounts can fairly easily find these days on social media. So it's a huge disconnect, and it really calls into question a lot of what traditional and legacy media have pushed as a narrative about themselves, about their place in the world, their place in the media ecosphere for decades now.
And you mentioned the new media. I mean, one of the difficulties is that the traditional media often seems to pick up on Twitter and Facebook and X as for news items. So and so said on Twitter, and that's led to, I think, a suspension of normal fact-checking abilities. It would appear to me. How do you feel about that?
Maybe in some ways, I think my greater concern about the current coverage on Gaza and on Israel is that there's a lot more suspension of traditional fact checking when it comes to Israel says. So what the Israeli government says, what its spokespeople say, what the spokespeople of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces say, um, what their diplomats at the UN say, that make very outlandish claims, starting with Prime Minister Netanyahu and on down, both in their official statements and what they say on social media, claims that could be fairly easily disproved and that are disproved on a daily basis in what's coming out often on social media, what we're seeing coming out of Gaza. And here we can just even take the example of famine and the international body that makes very careful determinations about when to declare a famine. Finally, did that about a month ago. In at least for northern Gaza and Gaza City, it didn't declare it for the entire territory, even though there's certainly widespread starvation across Gaza because of Israeli policies, and Israel's insistence in these cases to say that that they're allowing all the aid and food that needs to get in, of allowing that to enter the territory. And so we have a case, I think, where we don't see legacy media, for example, giving so in the pretense of equal weight to statements of letting Israel present its case and saying Israel says and conveying that. So often editors and gatekeepers will hide behind the idea that they're giving equal weight. And whereas the example I like to present to students is, we don't see editorial gatekeepers now for several decades haven't given equal weight to climate deniers, although we see a little bit of regression on that thanks to the Trump administration. But for a long time, we would see in legacy media when someone makes a case denying climate change, that they'll often be their view, maybe they'll get a little snippet or a little quote, but the view will often be negated pretty strongly in a broadcast, in a print piece, and it will be negated right away. And we don't see that same standard applied to Israel.
Well, my example when I've been challenged on this is if I am doing an article or a talk on space research, I don't go and consult the Flat Earth Society for comments.
Mhm. Yes, that's a great example, and I think many journalists and journalistic gatekeepers will say that you're right about that.
Well, you were also, I mean, you alluded to the some of the tactics. For example, when the pictures of the kids starving came up, there was a sort of camouflage of, well, these kids were all ill, and that wasn't mentioned, as though it were impossible to starve invalid kids. But there's a lesson there, isn't there? Because I've been covering the Middle East for 30 or 40 years, and looking over your shoulder is part of it. It's anticipating what the rebuttals will be and mitigating against them. So I would certainly, if I'd have been handling that story, stress that they were ill. And in fact, that even sort of compounded the crime of starving them. But
Mhm.
because that was omitted, this gives a sort of a doorway for the boot to come in.
It has been a doorway to challenge the legitimacy of that reporting, but I think the response by the legacy media outlets has been incredibly deficient. I mean, just as the response to the widespread killing of journalists in Gaza has been incredibly deficient. And so the response to add in these convoluted editor's notes and other things that some media organizations have done to say, oh well, we now hear this argument that they had these underlying illnesses, and as you said, and I think as many of us know, it tends to be the weak and the ill are the first ones to go, are the first ones who are most susceptible to starvation, and the fact that that's hasn't been part of the response, that the media organizations, you know, entertaining this response from the Israeli government and its supporters won't take that extra step and saying, well, wait a minute, the reality is, yes, some of these kids who have been the first to die, the first ones in this wave of starvation-induced deaths, the fact that they have underlying conditions only actually supports that there's a campaign of starvation and that it's getting more widespread and that it will impact more and more people. And um, and we also have just the history of 23 months. The people of Gaza, from adults, children, I mean, everyone hasn't had enough nutrition for the most part, and so you compound whatever underlying health issues people had.
But it is, could you sort of think of ways that people can anticipate and mitigate these? I mean, I think I mentioned to you in conversation my first piece for The Guardian 40 years ago. Uh, I inadvertently mentioned that there were mosquitoes in Jerusalem. It was part of the background color. And I was actually reported to the press council for anti-Semitism on those grounds. They were
Mhm.
going to
Yeah, well,
report me
yeah.
anyway for anti-Semitism because I thought I'd written the article rather subtly to because I was looking over my shoulder at accusations and you know how I say trying to head them off at the pass before they came. But I never expected the mosquitoes to sneak in and bite me.
Mhm. Well, I mean, that goes to what we've seen for 23 months. And, we saw it in earlier incarnations of criticism of the past Israeli wars against Gaza, but this is something that surpasses everything else in the past. But we've seen this weaponization of the charge of anti-Semitism, that criticism of Israeli policies, criticism of Israeli government policies, criticism of Netanyahu, criticism of anything associated with what Israel is doing in Gaza constitutes anti-Semitism, and is driven by anti-Semitism as opposed to being driven by a concern for human rights, for the welfare of Palestinians, a concern for seeing Palestinians as human beings who uh, who deserve protection from Israel as the occupying power, but also deserve protection from the rest of the world that has a responsibility to act. And I think we saw that weaponization early on, and it's been, more. It's coming across as more desperate as more time goes on. And I think more and more people around the world see the hypocrisy of deploying this um, weaponization of anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism is a real problem, as we all know. And in the long run, the Israeli government and its supporters are doing a disservice to any attempt to contain anti-Semitism, to any attempt to to stop the spread of anti-Semitism, because they're so actively conflating the actions of the state, the actions of this state of Israel, uh, as linked with anti-Semitism, and as something that can't ever be challenged because of that. It's hard to tell how much I think on a public level, the charge has less impact than it did even 22 months ago. Unfortunately, I think within U.S. legacy media institutions, and I'll speak to those because I know those the best. It still has a significant. It still inspires fear in managers and editors in newsrooms that don't want to deal with the orchestrated campaigns around this. And so there's a bit of a disconnect between the reading public, between the viewers, and what the gatekeepers and editors and the ways that they respond.
Well, your stuff for The Guardian and previously for Newsday, did you get examples of pressure? Because mo editors, the old media, when I was looking at it, were always very concerned about letters to editors. They didn't get many. So all it took was a dozen letters to sort of ring alarm bells. There might have been 500,000 readers, but 12 letters from readers was enough to ring alarm bells. And of course, the various lobbies have got, like, whether it's climate or Israel or Rwanda, have letter writing clerks who will deliver letters in droves, as happened to me with The Guardian on the occasion I referred to. So did you get much of that?
At Newsday, which was some time ago, I did a little bit. I happened to be lucky at Newsday in that I worked for a set of editors who didn't let that a certain set of immediate editors um, who didn't let that bother them, who didn't let the pressure of the letters. One of them, and kind of the top editor who was responsible for international coverage at Newsday, was Les Payne, who sort of later on, recently, unfortunately passed away several years ago. But right before his passing, he published the premiere biography of Malcolm X. He and his daughter published it, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for that. And it's sort of kind of his life's work as a journalist. But he was also an incredibly committed and effective editor at Newsday. And I know he dealt with pressure from some of the higher up editors, the very top editors at the institution, but he protected the correspondents and reporters who worked for him from that pressure. And that was a bit unusual. I think part of that was because also Newsday wasn't one of the top 3 or 4 national news. It wasn't the New York Times, it wasn't the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal. It wasn't so it wasn't as much of a target in
It was
some
trying to
ways.
carve out a niche as well, wasn't it?
Yes, it was trying to cover a niche, and part of that niche was to do reporting that others weren't doing. Um, but I do remember editors and readers writing in, sometimes calling the foreign desk back when people called the foreign desk, and that was something where I mean, sometimes in the editors, less than other editors, had at the beginning of the second Intifada in late 2000, and then a little bit in some later years, 2001, 2002, had sent me for short stints to report from Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza. But I spent a lot more time in Jerusalem and the West Bank. And they would get calls to the desk saying, "Oh, how can you send a guy named Mohammed to report from there? How is he possibly going to be fair? How is he going to be fair in his coverage?" And they would handle that, and they wouldn't quite let that get to me. And I think at a lot of other institutions that didn't happen as much. More recently, sort of in the columns and commentaries I've been writing for The Guardian, it's less, I think I get less of that directly um, from the editors, and I don't hear as much from the institution, partly because it's in the opinion pages and they publish a variety of opinions, and so that offers some protection. I see a bit. I get occasional emails from angry readers and who tell me how wrong I am, and I get occasional things on social media, but so far, and again, I think part of it is having this level of protection, uh, being an academic and being at an institution um, that hasn't been targeted as strongly by the Trump administration,
Yes.
provides some buffer zone.
Mhm. No, one of the results of this is there's a sort of concept that I don't think we've addressed enough, us generally as the profession. The idea of thought crime is when there's a whole consensus pushing along to actually go against the flow. And I noticed this recently when I think it was on CNN, and the interviewer was saying, but I was talking about the murder of journalists, and they said, but the Israeli government said, and I said, well, the Israeli government lied. They lied about Shireen Abu Aker. They
Mhm.
lied about all of the other people they shot. They lied about 15 people in the desert buried. They said it didn't happen, and then they said it wasn't there, and then they were excavated. They bulldozed them. And why would you take their word for it? And apparently this discombobulated her in a big way. And I got lots of emails and comments on it. I didn't actually get any death threats, but there were people suggesting Mossad should pay attention to me,
Mhm.
which I can
Yeah,
brush off.
that's a great. I think that's a great point because I think most other or practically any other government that has the track record of lying and misinformation that Israel has, which you just listed a slice of it that we can probably spend this entire segment going through examples, and so but we don't need to. It's easy to find those examples. Quite a few people have documented them. So that track record um, is it would disqualify most other governments from being taken as seriously as Israel is taken in the legacy Western media in particular. And I think we even see in the U.S. media in particular, we see a willingness to challenge the facts as presented by the U.S. administration in a stronger way than challenging Israel. Now, sometimes it takes a long time to get to that point. And I'm thinking your question and some of your earlier questions made me think about the coverage in the lead up to the Iraq War, for example, in 2003, the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, and there was certainly a drumbeat. A lot of the U.S. media fell in line behind the Bush administration, the second Bush administration, and accepted that administration's reasons for going to war wholesale, that later turned out to be lies, as we know, as sort of Iraq did not have WMDs. Iraq under Saddam Hussein, posed a danger to its neighbors, and but it didn't pose the danger that the Bush administration claimed it did. Um, and remember, there were so a lot of media organizations fell in line behind that in that lead up in 2000, late 2001, really in 2002, it ramped up. Some people lost their job. If you remember, and I try to remind students of this, students who have a sense, for the most part, that in their minds, the Iraq War was always unpopular, but when you go through actually that, for quite a few years, it was publicly popular, partly before the war, before the invasion, and partly because the media coverage was so slanted toward the administration's view. Um, but also there were people. I mean, one of the, I think, most extreme and best examples of what had happened was Phil Donahue. Remember, Phil Donahue was on MSNBC, which was supposed to be the liberal network, was taken off the air because of criticisms, because he was allowing critics of the war, he was giving them airtime. And he made this argument in this great Bill Moyers documentary about the media coverage of the war. It came out about 5 years after the war, after the invasion in 2008 or so. And Donahue, basically said to Bill Moyers, here was little me on MSNBC. I had an hour, and I was presenting this. At least I wanted to present this anti-war view, and I wanted to present at least the other side, as we claim. And the other 23 hours were pro-war, but still they couldn't handle that. And advertisers, that's sort of one of the other pressure points that you touched on, and that's often been the issue. It's a little bit less of an issue because media has a lot less advertising than it used to, legacy media. But that was often a pressure point, and now we see more pressure from the owners of the media organizations that happen to be billionaires, or otherwise, or friends of billionaires who could be influenced by the billionaire class and the oligarch class in the U.S. So those are always been pressure points, and we sort of see it going back to the coverage of the Vietnam War, other U.S. interventions and invasions, Grenada, elsewhere in the world, the first Gulf War certainly. So there's a pattern of this, and it does take time for um, the tide to turn, and questions. But I think one difference, I think we're still seeing Israel get much more of the benefit of the doubt than even the US government gets, and has gotten in previous wars.
That comes into the other concept of thought crime is that, I mean, you're younger than I, but I was in a generation where Israel was a cozy social democratic paradise with kibbutzim and they were nice people. And, we never heard from the Arab media. So we only got that one side. And it also comes to what I can consider the tyranny of the definite article. There's a sort of two stage. One is if you say the Jews and that they're instinctively part of Israel, then you're already laying hostage because there's no such thing as the Jews. There's Noam Chomsky and there's what's his name, Shmuley, the rabbi. They
Yeah.
are Jews, but they're not the Jews collectively. And by conflating it, it's very difficult when you're writing not to fall into these habits because you're laying open to accusations of anti-Semitism right away if you start referring to the Jews as opposed to a very particular segment.
And we're also seeing a lot of Jewish people at the forefront of the
Mhm.
pro-Palestine protests and movements all over the world, all over the West, certainly, in Europe, in the US. And I think a lot of the legacy media is struggling with how to present that, with how to sort of convey that there is a sizable segment of the Jewish community in these countries that's been highly critical of the war, that's been highly critical of the Israeli government and its actions. And I don't think a lot of the legacy media has found the way to convey that, because they're careful. They're worried about criticism. They're worried about organized campaigns to criticize their coverage, to force corrections. I think one of the other pressure points are organized groups. There's several of them. Camera is one of them. There's others that really go after media organizations and
Can you
work
spell out
hard.
camera? It's the campaign Middle
Yes,
East. Uh,
it's I'll actually I'll need to look it up in a
Okay, no,
moment
forget it.
to
But
sort of
it's the
spell out. Yeah, I
organization
don't
that's
remember. Yeah,
dedicated to to combating what it considers to be anti-Israeli bias in the media.
yes, in the media, and it spends a lot of effort trying to get corrections. So really going after editors and essentially nitpicking small points or things that, I mean, sometimes they're bigger points, but a lot of time. And so I think that creates, going back to your question about the climate, it creates the climate of editors being worried. They don't want to spend all their time fending off letters and requests. The other side, the pro-Palestine side, I don't think has gotten to that stage and hasn't sort of deployed the same kind of resources to try to get corrections, or if they have, they haven't
As
been as
effective.
effective at it. They're not as effective at it, and they don't have as long of a history.
But it
I
isn't.
think we're
Yeah,
I think we're
sorry.
getting on the chat that there are a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
If you want to go to, so there's either two questions, related questions.
Right. Do you want to address them?
Sure, I think I'll read them because I guess people
Well,
won't have
you'll
access
do it
to them.
instead of me
Uh,
then.
you unless you want to read them.
No, no,
You want to
no,
read them?
please
Yeah.
feel free.
If it's just today. So has that level of censorship been previously experienced in the United States? And if journalism in the US becomes more and more curtailed, if we ever will we ever be taken seriously again as far as fighting for freedom of the press internationally? Those are two great questions, and I think Ian, you'll have some thoughts on these questions as well. Um, should we take the second one first about fighting for freedom of the press internationally? If the U.S. press, legacy press, will ever be taken seriously on that?
Well, I've always been dubious. One of the things that worried me when I was at the United Nations and others is how much the international press takes its cue from the US press. It's that sort of infosphere that they're dedicated. And if, I don't want to keep mentioning, but I've got personal experience. When Kofi Annan was accused of the oil for food so-called scandal, which no one knows about now, I'm pleased to say. At the time, it was the biggest scandal in the history of the world. And it was conjured up because was cornered by the BBC and admitted that the war in Iraq was illegal. And they went after him for it. The Wall Street Journal, Fox, the whole panoply. And I was amazed at how little kickback there was, how few people actually went into it and attempted to dissect it. It was just much easier to jump on the bandwagon. And even if you didn't sort of substantiate it as a journalist, it's much easier to join the pack. I think lemmings would make good journalists. They often rush over the cliff if that's what people tell them to do. If that's where everyone else is going, they'll go. So the other one that just to counter, and I mentioned Noam Chomsky, was the question of the Balkan Wars again. There's a I was basically fired from the nation for suggesting that NATO had a perfect was entitled to intervene in Kosovo. There was a genocide going on. And, I was bell booked and handled out of the nation and other things because as a good leftist, you should not criticize our socialist brothers wherever they are. And I pointed out that Milosevic, neither Milosevic nor Putin come under any rubric of socialism that I got. But no, this inherent prejudice really told on people. And I found that lots of people who actually agreed with me didn't dare get up and say so. Some of them arranged for me to go on panels and speak, but they did not say anything themselves. I'm talking about some fairly high power names in journalism. But well, I wasn't worried because I didn't have a career to worry about as a freelance. But it was something, it's this moral pressure and social pressure to go along with the crowd that is worrying for a journalist. And
Mhm.
how do you combat it without coming out on the other side and being a partisan anti,
Mhm.
disestablishment type? You're a contrarian.
Yeah. Uh, Yeah, it's all excellent points, and I'll try to build a little bit on them, especially taking this second question about, as journalism in the U.S. becomes more and more curtailed, will we ever be taken seriously when fighting or trying to fight for the freedom of the press internationally? That's an excellent question, and I think it hints at uh, the double standards and the hypocrisy we've seen in the last 2 years. And I think my short answer would be that already U.S. legacy media institutions and many of the journalists associated with them aren't going to be taken seriously in the future when trying to fight for press freedom. Because if you don't begin um, to both fight for press freedom in the U.S., which is under threat. Uh, but also, if you're not consistent in the campaigns and in trying to stand up for your fellow journalists around the world, then that hypocrisy will come back to bite you. And I think here, you know, I, I'm I and many others have made this argument, is that one of the reasons Israel has been able to kill journalists, to kill so many Palestinian journalists with impunity, is not only because of the unconditional military and political support it receives from the US, but it's also partly the failure of many Western legacy media organizations and journalists to stand up for and defend their Palestinian colleagues. And so we've seen this double standard play out where a lot of Western, and especially the US outlets, they're often willing to publicly criticize governments, and they're willing to campaign for journalists who are harassed or imprisoned by US adversaries like Russia, China, and Iran. But then these institutions we've seen over the last 2 years have been largely silent when it comes to Israel, when it comes to this US ally. And so this hypocrisy of Western and especially US media, we've seen it laid bare in Gaza over the past 2 years. Um, and this isn't about journalism outlets taking a stand or taking a position on the war itself, but it's about taking a position on the deliberate targeting of journalists, as we've seen Israel consistently do. And in some cases, it's been the deliberate targeting of journalists who've worked as freelancers um, for these very own institutions, for these very own for these outlets, and we can just see the double standard. They're not; these institutions aren't standing up for the journalists, their own journalists sometimes, in the way that they have in other places when Russia is harassing them, or Iran, or is imprisoning, harassing them, or China, and there are other examples. And the world can see that, and viewers can see that, readers can see that, and they're reacting to this double standard. And we're also, I think, we've seen the Palestinian journalists of Gaza doing heroic work. I mean, no one is. It's incredible. I mean, when you think about it, knowing full well that you'll be targeted. Um, for your acts of journalism, for your work as a journalist. You'll be targeted
Targeted in a
and
literal
killed.
sense.
Yes, targeted in a literal sense and killed and warned, as Anas Sharif and others have conveyed to the world. They conveyed this the CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists, to other journalistic watchdogs and protection groups, that they were literally getting phone calls threatening them, telling them to leave for months and months, telling them to stop reporting and to leave Gaza City, northern Gaza, different parts of Gaza. So they're literally getting these threats, and they're ignoring them, and the bravery that it takes. And then we see one of the responses. It's despicable. There's been a response in some parts of the Western media. I'm thinking here of the Wall Street Journal publishing some op-eds and opinion pieces saying this, that questions whether these Palestinian journalists should be called journalists at all. They're literally giving their lives to the act of journalism, and we have journalistic institutions questioning questioning them being journalists. What do you say to that? And how, as a journalistic institution, I mean, how low do you have to go to discredit yourself, to put yourself in this position? And would you ever say that about Ukrainian journalists or others who've been also
Direct
targeted and who've
contrast,
been,
yes.
yes. And if you won't say that about Ukrainian journalists, then you shouldn't be saying it about Palestinian journalists.
Well, one of the points that hit me when with the controversy was the Committee to Protect Journalists. Every year they have fundraising, they have dinners, and all the editors and proprietors came up. So the CPJ has been consistently honest and brave about this. It's gone out in US NGO terms. It's gone out on a limb. But you don't get the
Mhm.
response from those editors and from those newspapers in the same way about Gaza, for example. That it there's a disconnect. So it's as though the editors know that this is true, but they don't want to go out on a limb and say so. It comes back to my idea of thought crime.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think you're right. I agree with you. CPJ has gone out of its has gone out on a limb on this. The executive director Jody Ginsburg has, I think, personally gone out on a limb in the interviews she's done, especially most in the past month and a half after Anas Sharif and his Al Jazeera colleagues were targeted and killed. I mean, a targeted assassination essentially. Um, and uh, and yes, and they are reliant. I mean, every year they do these dinners to fundraise to keep operational, and they're reliant on these media organizations and the owners to contribute money. I mean, I guess there's still some cachet for these media organizations to be associated with CPJ, and they do need it, for the time that
When it's their correspondent
Russia,
getting
yes,
shot in
yes,
Ukraine.
exactly, yeah, harassed by the Russians, and they sort of and they can help, but yes, we haven't seen we haven't seen anywhere near the campaigns that we've seen for in instances where U.S. Journalists or the journalists for U.S. media organizations have been targeted in countries that are adversaries of the U.S. And it's a very clear double standard, and people, viewers, readers, news consumers can see that.
Well, we should be thinking about winding up. I think I've kept you longer and we didn't have Chris to back us up, but what would you recommend? I mean, there are journalists, young journalists starting off. What would you recommend as for somebody to tread the fine line between being thought crimed into silence and to sort of criticism proof your copy? I mean, we mentioned one, the use of language or the fact that they should have come up front with the fact that the kids were invalids. It would have actually enhanced their story rather, starving invalids is more potent, but they didn't. And, but you have to know the enemy in a sense to anticipate these things. How would you recommend?
Yeah, I think we've seen that the statements and condemnations haven't worked. Those things alone haven't worked as a strategy, um, in terms of the targeting of Palestinian journalists. Um, and so something more tangible needs to be done for their protection. In terms of um, the struggle, especially for young people, people starting out, people who may not have much protection and might be exposed, just on a daily basis, working
I
at
don't want
news
to.
organizations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of foreign, because of the cutbacks in journalism, a lot of the foreign reporting and war reporting is done by freelancers
Mhm.
who have
We're
even
very
less
vulnerable.
protections. Yeah.
Yes. No, exactly. It is, and and we've seen cases over the years where um, those cutbacks, have just also led to those freelance correspondents being a lot of physical danger, being not having the same access to the resources that the news organizations in terms of security and insurance and all of those things. Um, and I mean, ultimately, journalism is in its ideal. Journalism is about getting to the truth.
We're on this on advice to aspirant journalists on how, if they fulfill their mission. I mean, it doesn't apply if you're covering weddings and funerals, but if you're covering wars and complex conflicts like this, then it becomes serious how you avoid the pressure. So to wind up, what would be your advice? Is there anything that we can do to support journalists on the firing line? Um, even morally, I think would be a big step
Mhm.
forward for some.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that institutions like the FPA, the Foreign Press Association, can do is bringing attention to when someone is harassed, wronged, detained, any of those things, and when they're targeted. Um, it's also about keeping up some form of public pressure and attention on particular cases, um, but also just expanding on a little bit on just what I touched on earlier that the ideal of journalism is supposed to be, a commitment to the truth, a commitment to conveying the reality of the world as it is. And one thing that means, and it's very difficult, it's especially difficult to do in an industry where right now there are few jobs. It's experienced several rounds of economic collapses over the past 10, 20 years. But so it's difficult to stand, to stand behind those principles and, to quit your job at an institution where that may not be happening, or you feel like you're being curtailed, um, or that you're being muzzled or silenced. That's extremely difficult. And especially if your livelihood is tied into that. Um, but I see some examples of journalists, some younger journalists doing that. I see examples of journalists, it's basically walking away from prestige institutions in some cases, because they think it's crossed a line. They think that they can't cope anymore um, with working for these institutions. So it's you know almost when I say think about the ways that you can do journalism um, independently, as difficult as that is, if you can do more meaningful work than you might be able to do within the constraints of these
At least with
institutions.
social media, you can have a
Hmm.
voice now, but it's
Yes,
not
and
as
some and
effective a
some
voice, and it's certainly not
no,
as well paying a voice.
yes, not and you don't necessarily have the cachet, but there are also now media, sort of a lot of new and newer media institutions that we've seen emerge in the past few years. The Intercept, I mean, there's the classic, traditional liberal leftist institutions of the Nation, maybe, and the Guardian and others. But there's also the Intercept, Zeteo News, Drop Site News, where they're doing a different kind of journalism than many of the legacy media. I mean, obviously, those institutions are still relatively small compared to the large media organizations, and they can't absorb everyone. Um, but they're also trying, I think, to go out of their way when they hire freelancers, when they hire people working on the ground, to pay them something livable, to sort of pay some real money at least, for individual stories or reports or broadcasts, and to do better than the kind of exploitative system that emerged around many of the legacy and larger media institutions in the last 10, 15 years, as they've cut back on foreign reporting, and as they've had so many freelancers eager to get published in these places, and they pay a pittance, right, to those freelancers.
That's why I stopped working for the Guardian's comment is free. They halved the rates, so I went on a
Mhm.
solo strike at the time.
Mhm.
Um, Never managed to go back to work. But we are coming to the end, I think, because we're taking a lot of your time. I'm sorry about Chris, who was going to the hospital. I hope he's recovering. And wherever you are, Chris, as they say here, thoughts and prayers for you. But we thank you very much, Mohamad Bazzi. Your students are very fortunate to have somebody who's got experience of these things and is prepared to speak objectively about them and supportively. Uh, I hope that we will do more like this and go into the actual moral nitty-gritty of reporting and journalism. So hope we can invite you back for larger panels in the future and hope that all the panelists can turn up next time. This is
Well, thank
Ian
you. Thank
Williams
you for having me.
from the Foreign Press Association. Thank you, Mohamad Bazzi, and we'll be in touch. This will be podcast and available online. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.